Israel Defense Forces, IDF, conducted airstrikes in Damascus, Syria on March 30th that resulted in the death of senior IRGC official Milad Heydari, which likely will prompt Iranian-backed militants to attack U.S. forces stationed in eastern Syria in the coming days. Recent Iranian attacks on U.S. forces in response to IDF airstrikes suggests a pattern in which Iran retaliates for instances in which IRGC personnel are killed. Local Syrian media reported that an IDF drone killed an IRGC official and a Lebanese Hezbollah official on March 23 near Abu Kamal, Deir ez-Zor province. The IDF drone strike occurred approximately 12 to 18 hours prior to the attack on U.S. forces in Asaka province, suggesting that Iran ordered the attack in response to the IDF drone strike and not the airstrike on Aleppo International Airport on March 22, which did not kill any IRGC personnel. CTP has observed several other Iranian-backed attacks on U.S. forces that support this pattern, which are outlined in the timeline graphic below. Iranian regime rhetoric suggests that Iran is preparing to respond with force. Iranian state-run Islamic Republic news agency, IRNA, described Heydari as an officer in the IRGC's cyber command. IRNA also described Heydari as one of the military advisors in Syria to Qadim Ol-Anbiya's Central Headquarters Command. Media outlets affiliated with the Iranian regime have uncharacteristically publicized Heydari's death and echoed threats of retaliation made by senior Iranian officials. This unusual emphasis on his death and the related threats suggests the regime is setting rhetorical conditions to respond by attacking U.S. forces in Syria. The Times of Israel reported that the target of the March 30th IDF airstrike was an Iranian asset-related microchips used in missile guidance systems and not Heydari. Iranian convoys smuggling precision-guided munitions, PGMs, and warehouses in Syria that store the PGMs are commonly targeted during Israeli airstrikes, suggesting Heydari may be involved in the Iranian effort to produce and smuggle missiles and other precision-guided munitions into Syria. Heightened Quds Force activity in eastern Syria is consistent with coordination or attack planning with local militias. Deir ez-Zor 24 reported that an IRGC Quds Force delegation arrived from Tehran to hold meetings in Al-Mayadin, Deir ez-Zor province with local Iranian-backed militias on either March 29 or 30. The arrival of the IRGC Quds Force is consistent with the spike in IRGC Quds Force activity in Deir ez-Zor province since March 25, which CTP additionally previously reported. The Quds Force held these meetings potentially to survey damage, improve morale amongst local forces after recent U.S. airstrikes, or to plan additional attacks on U.S. forces. CTP is not prepared to assess the location wherein such a strike would originate nor which U.S. positions in eastern Syria the attack would target. Iranian-backed forces have targeted U.S. positions across Hasaka, Deir ez-Zor, and Homs provinces from positions in both Iraq and Syria. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported on March 30th that unspecified Iranian-backed militants deployed to positions to Al-Ulayaniya, approximately 30 kilometers from the Al-Tanf deconfliction zone that surrounds the U.S. garrison at Al-Tanf in Homs province. CTP cannot verify the accuracy of this report, but Al-Ulayaniya's proximity to the T3 pumping station and multiple Iranian-backed militia positions in Palmyra, locations where Iranian-backed militants are known to store ISR and possibly kamikaze drones, suggest such a deployment may be in preparation to strike U.S. forces at Al-Tanf with a kamikaze drone. Iranian-backed militants conducting a retaliatory strike against U.S. forces in Syria could renew the tit-for-tat escalation cycle that occurred March 23 to 25, which would in turn risk additional attacks against U.S. forces. As CTP previously reported, media outlets associated with the Iranian regime and Lebanese Hezbollah likely executed a coordinated messaging campaign to communicate that the axis of resistance is prepared to further escalate against U.S. forces in the event of additional airstrikes. U.S. forces did not respond to a rocket attack in eastern Syria perpetrated by Iranian-backed militants on March 25. Iran may interpret the U.S. response to another potential attack on U.S. positions in eastern Syria as a continuation of the March 23-25 escalation cycle. The Iranian regime signaled its agreement to uncompromisingly enforce the mandatory hijab law on March 30th. The Interior Ministry issued a statement about the hijab on March 30th in which it wrote that there has not been and will not be any retreat and leniency in religious principles and rulings and traditional values. The Supreme Cultural Revolution Council previously issued a statement about the hijab on January 8th, as CTP previously reported. The council's statement emphasized the necessity of veiling but added that the weakness of some women's hijab should not be taken as a sign of their disbelief in religious principles, evincing a degree of tolerance that is not detectable in the Interior Ministry's March 30th statement. Iran's morality police operated, and may still operate, under the Law Enforcement Command, LEC, and Interior Ministry, further suggesting that the Interior Ministry's statement may be an indication that the regime has decided that it might adopt a confrontational approach to enforcing the hijab law. Social media users have circulated a greater number of videos showing individuals who appear to be shop owners and local officials confronting unveiled women in recent days. It is unclear whether this uptick in social media reports is due to regime officials cracking down on unveiled no-rouse travelers or whether these reports are indicative of a broader regime campaign to enforce mandatory veiling through confrontation. The regime likely considers co-opting pro-regime loyalists to enforce the hijab law as a safer approach to confrontation because it places blame for hijab enforcement on pro-regime citizens as opposed to the regime itself. Several Friday prayer leaders seemingly referenced this strategy in their Friday sermons on March 31st. Mashhad Friday prayer leader Ayatollah Ahmad al-Malhoda called on the LEC and airport and terminal officials to issue warnings to unveiled women. Karaj Friday prayer leader Mohammad Mehdi Hosseini Hamdani separately called on pious and veiled women to attend Karaj's Tulip Festival and help officials enforce mandatory veiling. This strategy may have long-term negative impacts on Iranian society, however. Placing responsibility for hijab enforcement on pious citizens may exacerbate the schism between regime supporters and dissidents. Iranian authorities arrested several improperly dressed girls who insulted and beat a veiled woman in Qom on March 27, for example. This incident highlights that regime dissidents may increasingly equate pious citizens with the regime itself if the regime continues to call on these citizens to enforce mandatory veiling. The individuals who embrace the regime's call to enforce veiling may additionally disregard regime officials' warnings to avoid physical and violent confrontation with unveiled women. Iranian social media users widely circulated a video on March 31st of a man pouring yogurt on two unveiled women in a grocery store in Khorasan Razavi province. Such incidents place the regime in a bind. It must either ignore acts of violence and assault against unveiled women and risk fueling greater public anger toward the regime or condemn such incidents and alienate the individuals whom it is attempting to co-opt to enforce the hijab law. Continued conversations on mandatory veiling are particularly noteworthy amidst the regime's relative silence on how to address Iran's deteriorating economic conditions. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei implied that the primary topic of inter-regime debate should be the economy during his no-rouse address on March 21st, as CTP previously reported. The majority of Friday prayer leaders discussed veiling more passionately and comprehensively than the economy in their sermons on March 31st, however. Their focus on mandatory veiling as opposed to the economy highlights that the regime likely believes it can confront hijab violations more easily than it can Iran's economic challenges. The regime is additionally unwilling to implement fundamental reforms that would cause short-term economic disruptions but ultimately improve Iran's economic health, as CTP previously reported. The Iranian regime's threats to securitize Zahedan have been ineffectual in deterring prominent Sunni cleric Moulana Abdol Hamid from criticizing the regime in his weekly sermons. Abdol Hamid indirectly endorsed a referendum against the regime, echoing his call for foundational change on February 17, as CTP previously reported. He commented that when a political system falls apart, a referendum is a great thing, and attributed the regime's crisis of legitimacy to its narrow-minded and sectarian worldview. Abdol Hamid noted that post-revolutionary Iran was not inclusive of different ethnicities, religious sects, genders, and diverse belief systems, and stated that the Islamic Republic does not represent the people and is neither Islamic nor a republic. Abdol Hamid's comments specifically referenced Islamic Republic Day, a public holiday in Iran celebrating the March 1979 referendum that established the regime. Abdol Hamid continued to sustain his highly critical rhetoric despite the regime's threats to securitize his hometown of Zahedan. IRGC Ground Forces Commander Brigadier General Pakpour set the rhetorical conditions on March 28 to degrade Abdol Hamid's anti-regime following in Zahedan, as CTP previously assessed. The regime has thus far allowed Abdol Hamid to occupy a permanent political space, making it increasingly difficult for the regime to suppress him and his movement as time goes on. Abdol Hamid will likely maintain his anti-regime posture without escalating to an overtly revolutionary position. The latter would likely instigate a violent regime crackdown in response, jeopardizing Abdol Hamid's ability to sustain his criticism of the regime without posing any danger to himself or his following.